Hi, welcome to MINDfields. I'm Jackie Demeritt, and I am here in Toronto at the ISA conference with Karen Rasler. Karen, thank you for being here and taking time out from your conference schedule.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So our first question for you is, what research of yours are you most proud of and why?
I'm not like typical scholars who have the big work, the big book. I think most of my career has been characterized by streams of different kinds of research, different research programs for the most part. But I do have favorites, okay? And my latest favorite, largely because of where the field in IR, and at least among young people, is moving, is to subnational conflict. And it's the American Sociological Review piece on the Iranian Revolution, on repression and accommodation. And when I first wrote that, I really had no idea that it was as forward-leaning as it was. Because when it got published, nobody cited it because it was in a sociological journal and not an IR journal. It wasn't an IR topic in 1996. And suddenly, in the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a real shift among younger scholars who are interested in civil wars, repression, human rights violations, and suddenly I see my work being cited in lots of different kinds of places, and I get such a charge out of that. That's I really enjoy it, and so in that sense, a work that I thought was kind of, didn't have much visibility, suddenly coming back and having some resonance for the most part. So I really find that to be one I enjoy, and it's also one of my favorites right now. I think is because I find myself returning to the subject matter. And a lot of it has to do with, well, a couple of reasons. One is this new turn toward subnational conflict, but in particular, protest campaigns. Erica Chenoweth's work with Maria Stephan, where they systematically collected a whole bunch of protest campaigns. I called them protest waves way back in the 90s. And then the Arab Spring happened. And I saw the dynamics of the Egyptian 2011 case and saw that there were so many similarities to the Iranian one. So I decided and so somebody asked me to go to a conference, and I wrote a qualitative analysis on the Egyptian one. So I've really been re-energized by protest campaigns, but basically about the relationships between repression and protests and larger processes of political behavior. So in that sense, that ASR article is one of my favorites right now, largely because it was a little forward-leaning, and I didn't know it at the time. But it also has front and center in the new interest on protest campaigns, and then the Arab Spring has kind of brought me back to it. So I'm going to be doing more work on that this summer, and I have a new colleague we're going to look at Turkey, because the Gezi Park demonstrations in 2011, right out of the Arab Spring, but for the most part snuffed out, or for the most part demobilized, and so we're kind of looking at that as a negative case with some positive cases in the Arab Spring.
It's a natural experiment.
So yeah, so if you're saying what's my favorite, it's the latest one that's kind of generated my interest in a new research program.
So I have a follow-up question, but it turns out it's the next question, so that works really well.
Okay.
The question is, what led you to undertake the research project for which you're most widely known? I guess my assumption is that would be.
Yeah, but also there's another, but it relates to another one, and that's the war-making, state-making work that I did, and which I think my early work would be important. If anybody recognized me, it'd probably be in that work as well. But how did I get into protest campaigns or protest waves? When I was a graduate student, I was at Florida State University, and I stumbled on the war-making, state-making literature by Charles Tilly. And he had this great, big, humongous edited book. Feiner was in it, Stein-Rocan's work was in it, Charles Tilly's work in it, War Made the State and the State Made War, and it was very catchy. And it really influenced my thinking about war impacts. But then I went to the ICPSR program, to get some more methods. And I went to a Borders bookstore before Borders had spread all over the country. And Charles Tilly's work was all over the bookshelves, and in particular the resource mobilization book.
Was this in Ann Arbor?
Yeah, it's in Ann Arbor. And so I read it, and it just really, between the war-making, state-making work that he did, and that resource mobilization work that he did, really transformed the way I thought about, internal conflict. And it's really what it is. And my dissertation was on the Lebanese Civil War in the 70s and the Syrian intervention and how that had escalated the conflict as well between the actors as well as between Syria and that. So basically Charles Tilley's work led me to think more about dynamics, made me think about repression as not an attribute of a state, but as a tool or a policy in the context of challenges that are made by non-state actors. Made me think about how the state, for the most part, is a perpetrator of a lot of violence, whereas protesters are largely violence against property. It just transformed the way I thought about internal conflict. And I thought it was fascinating because it went against the grain in IR because it was all T.R. Gurr's work, Ted Robert Gurr's work, which was a sociological approach,
right.
And very important. And I think to some extent it got supplanted a little bit by the resource mobilization folks, but is now revived, and so in other words, so I liked it because it was just so unusual, and it really spoke to the way I think about conflict, which is power struggles, which is a typical IR way of looking at it. And so I like that domestic conflict, and everybody kept saying, "Gee, Charles Tilley's internal conflict stuff sounds like he's like an IR scholar, struggles between contenders,
right.
And some contenders have more power than others." But what he did was he helped us to understand not only. Well, he gave us a better understanding of how to collect these kinds of events because he did it in his own cases, but also I think what he did was made us think about how actors interact with each other, state and non-state. And so in that sense, I'd say Tilley was a very formidable person in the way I thought about things.
So one of the things I love about that paper is there's a line in the introduction where you say that understanding the Iranian case should extend or may extend understanding to other cases of revolution. Right. Why Iran in that case? Was it timing? So you're an 81 PhD, right? And
yeah.
That was 79?
Yes, it was. I don't really know how I stumbled on it. I mean, I'm sorry, I can't help young scholars how these things pop up into your head. But it is an interesting case, and I'm trying to go back and reflect on that. It was just a fascinating case, from a qualitative point of view. I've always had a Middle East focus.
Okay.
If you look at the things that I've written, I've done the Lebanese Civil War, I've done the Iranian Revolution, I've done rivalry termination and involved the Palestinians and Israelis, at least until the Oslo case, and now it's reasserted again. And now the Egyptian case, and then I'm going to do Turkey with this young co-author and friend of mine. So I've always had a Middle East interest, and I think it was because it was such a self-contained event. Mm-hmm. It started in 77, and it was over by, 79 or by, so it was short and contained and episodic, and I became captured by Sidney Terrell's work on protest waves. So in that sense, hey, this is a protest wave rather than it is a war or an urban revolt, as people called it. And I'm really shy away from this concept of revolution because it was really just, it was a revolution, but it was the outcome of a protest campaign that led to the resignation or withdrawal of the Shah. So it was very self-contained, and I decided to collect the data, and it was accessible. The data was accessible in the sense that I could find English-based sources, and there were an awful lot of qualitative work that I could draw on to add more protests and so on to the data. And ironically, I thought in that ASR piece it was a little, it's now when I look back on it, it's a little over-aggregated. So I'm going to go back this summer and I'm going to recode the data so I can understand diffusion processes a little bit better across the cities and the area. Idea. So fortunately, again, Charles Tilley had influenced me enough to get a lot of detail on everything I could on every possible event. But so with the Iranian Revolution, I wish I could give you a better answer. I think it's because it was a protest wave. I've always been interested in Middle East, and I think it was because it was self-contained, short, and the case was so interesting.
I think that's a great answer.
Okay.
It was interesting and it's puzzling and kind of reflected what you were thinking about.
And also at the time, I was reading a lot of Mark Lichtbach's work. Mm-hmm. Okay, and he was looking at substitutability, when to switch from violence to nonviolence. So I have to say, Mark Lichtbach, I see him more as a contemporary. Was influencing me as well. And I saw an awful lot of the inconsistency of repression. Sometimes they use it, sometimes they don't. And so there are some unpredictable elements there, the carrot and stick strategy. So Mark Lichtbach made me start thinking about strategies and how that intersects with tactics of protest groups as well. So I think by reading that, and I thought, hey, between Mark Lichtbach's work and that interesting case, I bet we can tease out and test some of these kinds of mechanisms. And so that's where it came from. You know.
Do you mind if I tell my graduate students that when we read the paper in my
Sure,
seminar?
sure, I'm honored.
They're always like, I'm wondering how you choose cases.
Yeah, well, it's not the best way because
Aww.
we're supposed to match up cases, positive and negative cases, and we're supposed to have a little bit more of a logic of comparison. So,
but this is a great case where you're looking at one case and sort of disaggregating and comparing within that case and looking at strategic interactions.
Yeah.
And so...
Yeah, but fortunately, the people at the American Sociological Review didn't make me say, why Iran? Which is what we make our students, fortunately, and that's the appropriate way. An appropriate thing to do is ask our students why that particular case.
It's important to think strategically, but it's important to care.
I agree.
As well.
I agree. You have to have something that captures your imagination.
Yeah, that fire to steady it.
Yeah.
Cool. So our next question is what? Oh, looking back at the evolution of the field over the course of your career, what do you think should have received more attention?
You mean in the field?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Either research or scholars or topics.
Okay, a couple of things. Well, first of all, there should have been a shift toward human rights and subnational conflict much earlier than it was. Okay. It took us way too long. And it's almost, by the time we started doing it, it's because we ran out of wars to study. And I thought, again, my dissertation was on the Lebanese Civil War, and I saw intimate connections between, internal conflict as well as neighborhood rivalries playing out in internal conflicts. And so I think we should have made a turn in that direction a lot more sooner. But the fact that we're doing it now, this whole new generation, your work, Courtney Conrad's work, Will Moore's work, I could go on, Reed Wood's work, Alex Braithwaite's work. I'm afraid of leaving somebody out. Emily Ritter's work. Everybody is switching now to thinking about repression and what generates repression. But also the other thing is I think we've been big on big cross-end studies, but we haven't really been good on over time dynamic processes. And I still think we're struggling over that, okay? Whereas we are looking at subnational conflict an awful lot, but I'm not sure that I see a lot of it in terms of dynamics, okay? And so I'd like to see a push more toward understanding diffusion processes. And that means not just strong theories about that, but also even more fine-grained data than we already have. And the startup costs of that are very, very high, and getting it costs a lot of money. And whatever data we have, we don't necessarily, for one reason or another, find it reliable or whatever else. So I would, if anything, I'd like to see this continued shift toward subnational conflict, human rights, conflict management processes, work. I think are just really fascinating, and I can start laying out all the various people in schools all over the world who are basically focused on these kinds of questions, because I've been watching this evolve for a long period of time in a very happy sort of way. But I still think we are struggling over dynamic processes. I still think we're too cross-sectionally or static-oriented.
So the human rights stuff should have come earlier. Is there anything else that you think should have received more attention? Or it's more we get there eventually, and it's just
I think
so. When we
I
get
mean,
there.
yeah, exactly. I think I think research programs come and go. They have life cycles, and for a while, certain kinds of research programs dominate our interest, and largely it's the result of what's happening in the international system. I was a little faddish in that respect. So our whole interest in the democratic peace, being stimulated by changes in the international system where we see the rise of democracies for the most part. The end of the Cold War and things like that. And of course, the end of the Cold War brings up all this internal conflict as well. And that's probably one of the reasons why we've shifted toward that. So I don't know if we should have. I mean, I just think it's, research programs come and go, and they're tied to the challenges that we face in the international system. And I think that human rights issues, subnational conflict, have become more prominent since the end of the Cold War and since there's been a tremendous decline in interstate war. And so I don't know if anything should have gotten more attention. I just think it's kind of the nature of the evolutionary process.
That we sort of react to what we see
Yeah.
and seek to explain it.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you know, the desire to be relevant, you know what I mean, is important too. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, okay, we didn't lose our. I thought that went black for a second.
Oh, it might, but
You're gonna
it
have
will
to
keep
edit this
recording,
out.
and we'll get rid of this in
part
post.
out.
It might go dark, but we can. It'll keep recording.
Okay.
Then we just don't have to
Just
look at
slice
ourselves.
this part out.
Yeah, this never happened.
Okay.
I'm pausing so I can come back
That's
in.
fine. We can. That's nice. Erica kept telling me, pause, Karen. Take lots of pauses.
Yeah.
They'll edit out the pause.
We'll edit out everything we don't like.
Okay.
All right. So, are there any approaches or theories or topics, etc., that you think should have received? So, I asked you about things that should have received more attention. Is there anything you think should have received less attention from the community?
No.
That's
That's a politically difficult thing. First of all, it's not difficult for me to say no to just because everything, even if it's a dead end, is a way of understanding and learning about things. So, no, I don't have a particular pet peeve about we spent too much time on this or we did this. I guess I've always been a person who's interested in time series analysis, dynamic processes, fine-grained data. So if there's one thing I might have a grumble about, it might be too much of an emphasis on over-aggregated data and data sets that have over-aggregated conflict or other kinds of variables as opposed to opening them up.
What do you think is the danger in over-aggregation? Is that sort of a barrier to inference, or is it, like, what is it that bugs you about that?
There's so many more interesting causal relationships that you can tease out of our understanding of the world around us, as opposed to just saying, you know, states that have a lot of civil wars, okay, are likely to have large numbers of ethnic groups. Okay, well, you know, if we open and unpack what civil war means, so there's a lot of different dimensions to civil war, which means that there are lots of different kinds of connections to the role of ethnicity, okay, and grievances and discrimination. So in other words, we just, we black box too many more interesting theoretical and causal relationships by over-aggregating. So I like to see, so that if there's a grumble, it would have been that. But I think that there's been a recognition by a large number of people. So I don't think this is unusually new or controversial for the most part as well.
I like that claim that sort of it's worth investigating even if it gets you nowhere. Then we know it gets you nowhere. And
right.
We
Well,
can
we've
move on to
all
what's
had
next.
dead ends. We've all pursued a
to
research
admit it,
project where it didn't come to anything. I remember I was working on public opinion for a year or two, and it just didn't go anywhere. It was because I wasn't a very good analyst of public opinion. I didn't know the literature very well. I just gave up on it, you know what I mean? And let other people who do it better.
Yeah.
So, but I learned a lot about public opinion. So yeah, that's a knowledge base that we always have. But there are other people who, you know, I don't know. I'm not sure there's any such thing as an analytical dead end, because somebody else will come along with a new innovative way, either methodologically or they'll slip in something from a different field. Okay. Like I think geography's had a big influence on the way subnational conflict scholars are thinking about conflict now.
Yeah.
And so suddenly we're getting not just new data, but we're getting new techniques, applied spatial statistics. We're thinking about how geography affects, you know, relationships between people, as well as conflict. So So in other words, something may go dead for a while, and then suddenly people come back and revisit the question again with new data, new innovations, new ideas. And so in that sense, I'm not sure that there have been any obvious dead ends in my mind.
Maybe for individual people, but not sort of for the field
right,
as a whole.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm an optimistic person. I
like it.
I think the field is full of, you know, hardworking scholars that are really trying to advance their discipline in the field, and you know, without any necessarily hegemonial intentions or something like that.
Yeah,
you know. So.
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you're interested in it, it's worth investigating, and if it gets you nowhere, then you've scratched that itch, and somebody will pick it up.
And then 5 or 6 years or 10 years later, somebody will come back and revisit it, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, If you had done an interview like this when you were mid-career and you were sitting here instead of there, who would you have liked to have interviewed?
Charles Tilly. And I would have liked to have interviewed him, somewhere between 1999 and 2003.
Okay.
Because in 2001, he published his Dynamics of Contention book with Doug McAdam and Sidney Terrell. And what he did was he really wanted to shift the research program that he was a part of, which was the social movement, political opportunity structure, kind of static approach to understanding how social movements emerge, evolve, and what impacts they have. And he really wanted to shift everybody's attention toward thinking about dynamics and causal mechanisms, and how there might be robust causal mechanisms in the context of, say, a protest campaign. How often do those causal mechanisms appear? How do they vary? And how are they shaped by situational contexts or whatever? So it was very controversial, because when I read his book in 2001, I didn't really particularly like it. And I think it's because I really didn't understand what he was going for at the time. And because it looked like it was kind of atheoretical, more ad hoc, more driven by historical studies and stuff. And so as a year, again, this is another reason why I want to come back and revisit protest campaigns and look at Egypt and Iran and Turkey and several other cases, is because I want to come in from a mechanisms process approach, which is what he and his co-authors were advocating in 2001. And because now I appreciate what they were trying to do. I have a better understanding of what they were trying to do, because for the simple reason that I've watched protest campaigns over 10 or 15 years, and now I understand where they were coming from. And so I think IR is poised to make a major contribution if we can get IR scholars to read social movement theory and basically see to what extent those causal mechanisms are really robust and lots of different kinds of episodes of protest movements and whatever, and basically look for the appropriate positive negative cases and whatever. And I've also had a deeper and better appreciation of analytical narratives, because I've always been a quantitative IR scholar. Mm-hmm. And so I have a much deeper appreciation of the connections between analytical narratives and the empirical evidence that we can bring to bear, that we can leverage both. Mm-hmm. So I would sit there and would have spent a lot of time with Charles Tilly saying, why'd you do this? Although it's all there, it's all in the written record, but I would have tried to, would have been fascinated about hearing it from his own lips, so to speak.
That's why I asked you about Iran. Absolutely.
Yeah, it would have been fascinating to have heard him. And also to ask him, because he and his co-authors really faced a kind of a backlash within his own community with this shift toward a dynamics of contention approach. Really? And I would have been very interested in trying to understand what was going on in sociology or within his research community, and how he dealt with the issues of a semi-hostile environment. You know what I mean?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I would have been very interested in how does he, is he so self-confident that he can sit there and say, I know I'm right. I'm not sure I'm that kind of scholar. If I got a lot of negative feedback, I would question what I'm doing. And yet he never did. He stuck to his guns, and here we are in 2014, and I think that book it's a little hard to read, but it's important. It's very, very important. And I think that people have, he wrote another book just before he passed away on performances, contentious performances, which really helped people to understand a little bit of the 2001 work. But Sidney Terrell's written some more work trying to explain that 2001 book. And so over the years, I've got a better appreciation. And then I go back to the book and I say, I see what they were saying. So I would have liked to have understood that evolution for Charles Tilly and his co-authors and hear it personally. Would have been fun. Would have been fun. So, and he was a very nice guy. My interactions with him were always positive.
I regret that I never met him.
Yeah, and I would have liked to have had an opportunity to have done that. So, so that's the person I would have interviewed, and not an IR scholar, but somebody in a related discipline, but still has enormous things to say about protest movements, protest campaigns, episodes of protest waves that we are probably seeing more and more of. Every day you open up, Venezuela, Ukraine, they're popping up everywhere, and that in itself is very interesting too.
I think the blurring of lines not only between IR and comparative, but between political science
Yeah.
and sociology and anthropology
Exactly.
and economics and
Exactly.
we're all looking to explain the same phenomena.
Yeah, and since I mentioned protest campaigns, I think the people in political science who've done a really good job of it are the comparativists. You know what I mean? People like Graham Robertson has done some really interesting work, and Valerie Bunce has done some really interesting work, and a whole slew of other people I'm not mentioning have done really interesting work that crosses over with some social movement literature, but also is really important for us to draw on in our understanding of IR. But I think what we do, well, Valerie Bunce is trying to do this too, but let's bring the international context. Let's weigh international pressures on regimes and their choices and tactics in terms of how they deal with protest movements would be really good. That's something IR scholars are usually pretty sharp about, you know. But anyway, so it would have been him, you know.
It would have been great.
Yeah.
So our last question, and you've answered this somewhat, but I'm interested in if there's anything else, is what do you think are the most exciting or promising areas in current research and then in future research?
Well, future research, I want more dynamic analysis. I want to see more diffusion processes. I'd love to see network analysis in a dynamic fashion rather than just descriptive approaches. I'd like to see geography intertwined with strong theory, again, in terms of overtime processes as well. So that's where I'd like to see more and more emphasis, and that if that means even more fine-tuned and fine-grained data, I think that is worth the investment to do it as well. And there is a lot of promising new research. I think your research is really very interesting. I've been reading it. An awful lot of the work on repression and under what conditions states repress. So I just got done reading some of Emily Ritter's work on, job security, and that was interesting. And the human rights work that I think Courtney Conrad and Emily Ritter and Will Moore, they're moving us beyond that physical integrity rights approach and getting us to look at human rights from a more sophisticated sort of way and connecting it with more theoretically stronger arguments, I think, as well. So, and then the other kinds of work that I really like is I see an awful lot of really interesting work on ethnic conflict. So the Cederman work and with Gleditch and Soleil's work, transnational border ethnic groups, really fascinating work. And that's why I think there, and frankly, the Cederman et al. Team, Cederman, Wimmer, and Gleditch, put together this data set on ethnically, politically relevant, groups and which ones are excluded, and when they're excluded, they're more likely to be engaged in internal conflict. And it harkens back to, it's very much a kind of Tilley perspective, but it also is rooted in the social sociological approaches of Gura when they talk about grievances. Yes. So I really am happy to see grievances come back because I think grievances are really, really important. So I really like that literature that's emerging for the most part. And then there's the work by Kristen Bakke that I really like. She's very interested in how groups fragment, ethnopolitical groups fragment, and how and what and why that happens. And then I'm thinking Wendy Perlman's work on Palestinians. Right, that goes right there. I really like that work as well. And I know I'm leaving out so many interesting developments. Reed Wood's work I really like as well as on civilian victimization is really important. And then there's IR scholars who do that. So I really think that, and the geography-related works, Niels Weidmann's work is really interesting to me, and the way he uses geography, I really like that as well. And so I think there's just a lot of new stuff going on in terms of our new methods, new data collections, and more sophisticated theory that we're bringing to these questions. So I'm really excited by it.
You're super optimistic. I love that.
Yeah.
I need more of that in life.
Yeah, I know. Maybe it's the nature of what we study. Like we think if we study it long enough and learn it well enough that these things will disappear, So
I do believe that. I don't know if it's true, but it motivates me.
You said it. Otherwise, it'd be depressing. How do we get through the day? Too. Every time you turn around, you're reading about, violence in Congo or, one-sided violence here or there. It's really, it gets you down.
And when it doesn't, that's dangerous too.
Yeah.
It's about finding that balance between caring and being connected and being able to sort of analyze from outside.
Right.
It's a hard balance to find.
Yeah. I think you're right. So.
Life is a learning process.
Mm-hmm.
We'll edit that out too.
Okay.
My musings. not interesting to the world.
Okay.
All right. So, I think we're good.
Good. Did I talk long enough?
I don't know what long
about
enough
30
is.
minutes.
Yeah.
Good. That's about what we're looking for.
Perfect.
Great. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Wasn't so bad. I think you had a lot to do with that. So, all right.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
No, it's a real pleasure. Thanks for thinking. What made you guys think to ask me to do this?
We made our own wish lists and thought about folks who we'd be interested in learning from. And
well, thank you.
You had said you were interested in why Tilly, sort of how he dealt with hostility and why he did what he did, and that's the same sort of place that it came from. So I have no satisfying scientific answer, but I respect your work a lot, and I've been inspired by it a lot. I'm trying to think if anyone else said it, because if I say yes and I'm wrong, then my record is being wrong.
Well, I hope it was you.
Partially
well,
me,
I hope
for
it was
sure.
You. I really that makes me feel good, for the most part. Thank you. I'm delighted to have been asked.
Absolutely.